4. A fundamental socialist work. The manuscript which Engels had completed was The Condition of the Working Class in England in 1844, and it was published in the summer of 1845 in Leipzig by Wigand, who had been the publisher of the Deutsche Jahrbucher and had published Stirner's Ego and his own a few months before. As the last offshoot of Hegelian philosophy, Stirner slid into the shallow wisdom of capitalist competition, whilst Engels in his book laid the basis for those German theorists who had developed to communism and socialism as a result of Feuerbach's dissolution of Hegelian speculative philosophy, and who represented the majority. He described the conditions of the English working class in all their ghastly reality, a reality typical of the rule of the bourgeoisie. When Engels reissued his book almost 20 years later, he called it a phase in the embryonic development of modern international socialism and added, just as in the earlier stages of its development the human embryo still shows the gill formations of our forefathers, the fish, so this book betrays everywhere the signs of the origin of modern socialism from one of its forefathers, German classic philosophy. This is true, but with the modification that these signs are much weaker than they were in Engels' contributions to the Deutsch-Französische Jahrbucher. This time neither Bruno Bauer nor Feuerbach is mentioned, and Franz Stirner only occasionally, and then in order to make game of him a little. The influence of German philosophy on this book must be considered as definitely progressive and no longer retrograde. The real value of the book lies less in the descriptions it gives of the proletarian misery which developed in England as a result of the capitalist mode of production. For in this respect Engels had numerous predecessors, Buret, Gaskell and others, from whom he quoted freely. And it is not even the burning indignation against a social system which subjected the working masses to such terrible sufferings, or the moving and graphic descriptions of those sufferings and the deep and heartfelt sympathy with the victims, which give the book its special character. The most admirable and at the same time the most noteworthy historical feature of the book is the thoroughness with which the 24-year-old author understands the spirit of the capitalist mode of production and succeeds in explaining from it not only the rise, but also the decline of the bourgeoisie, not only the misery of the proletariat, but also its salvation. The aim of the book was to show how large-scale industry created the modern working class as a dehumanized, physically shattered race, degraded intellectually and morally to the point of bestiality, and how, thanks to a process of historical dialectics whose laws he reveals in detail, it develops, and must inevitably develop, to the point of overthrowing its creator. The rule of the proletariat in England, it declared, would come about as the result of the amalgamation of the working class movement with socialism. Such an achievement as this book represented could only have been the work of one who had mastered Hegelian dialectics until they had become second nature and who had placed them squarely on their feet instead of leaving them upside down. The book therefore became one of the foundation stones of socialism as its author had intended. However, the great interest which it aroused on its publication was not due to this, but rather to the matter with which it dealt. One of the academic bigwigs observed with comic vanity that the book made socialism fit for the university. But this was true only in the sense that this or that professor broke a rusty lance against it. Above all, the learned critics swelled with pride when the revolution which Engels observed on the threshold of England did not materialize. But 50 years later he declared imperturbably that the astonishing thing was not that this or that prophecy made in youthful ardor did not come to pass, but that so much had come about, although at the time he had seen it in the much too near future. Today the youthful ardor which saw many things in the much too near future is not the least attraction of this pioneering book. Without its shadows its light would be unthinkable. The eye of genius which descries the shape of the future from the present sees coming things more clearly and, therefore, nearer than the eye of common sense, which has difficulty in getting used to the idea that the steaming soup need not inevitably appear on the table just at dinner time. However, there were other people in England besides Engels who saw the revolution approaching, including even the Times, the chief mouthpiece of the English bourgeoisie. But in this case an uneasy conscience saw only devastation and slaughter in the revolution, whilst the social eye of Engels saw new life springing from the ashes. Engels' youthful ardor found expression apart from this book. During the winter of 1844–45, whilst it was still on the anvil, he had other irons in the fire. Apart from the continuation of the book, which was to be only the first section of a larger work on the social history of England, he proposed to issue a socialist monthly together with Moses Hess. a library of foreign socialist authors, a critique of Liszt, and other things as well. His plans often coincided with those of Marx, and he tirelessly urged on the latter: finish off your economic work finally, even if you are not completely satisfied with it. It doesn't matter. Men's minds are ripe now, and we must strike the iron whilst it's hot. Time is pressing, and therefore see to it that you are finished by April. Do as I do, set yourself a date by which you must positively be finished, and then see to it that it appears in print as quickly as possible. If you can't have it printed there, then try Mannheim or Darmstadt or somewhere else. But the great thing is that it must appear quickly. Engels even consoled himself over the astonishing length of the Holy Family with the idea that it wasn't a bad thing after all. In that way a lot has already seen the light of day which might otherwise have lain in your desk heaven knows how long. How often was he to raise his voice in similar exhortations during the coming years? He was impatient when he urged Marx to complete his work, but he was the most patient helper when genius, engaged in a hard struggle with itself, was at the same time hard pressed by the petty miseries of practical life. As soon as news came to Barmen that Marx had been expelled from Paris, Engels opened up a subscription to divide communistically amongst us all the extra expenses which you have been caused. Reporting the good progress of the subscriptions, he adds, I don't know whether you will find the sum sufficient to set yourself up in Brussels, but I should like to point out that as a matter of course the honorarium which I hope to receive soon, at least in part, for my first English thing is at your disposal with the greatest pleasure. In any case I don't need it myself for the moment because the old gentleman must lend me anything I need, if necessary. The curs shall at least not have the pleasure of causing you pecuniary embarrassment as a result of their infamy. And for a generation Engels was tireless in his efforts to rob the canaille of this pleasure. As light-hearted as Engels appears from his youthful letters, he was very far from being frivolous. The first English thing, to which he refers in such an offhand fashion, has since proved its sterling worth for over 90 years. It was an epoch-making work, the first great document of scientific socialism. When he wrote it Engels was 24 years old, and this in itself was sufficient to raise the dust-in clouds from the academic bigwigs. But his was not a precocious talent rapidly developed in the clammy heat of a hothouse to wither away rapidly in the open air. His youthful ardor developed from the inexhaustible fire of a great idea which warmed his declining years as it had inspired his youth. And in the meantime he led a quiet and peaceful life in all godliness and respectability in the house of his parents, a life which must have satisfied the most punctilious Philistine. But he soon grew tired of it, and only the doleful faces of his parents caused him to have another shot at commerce. In the spring he planned to leave home and go first of all to Brussels. His family troubles were greatly intensified by communist propaganda in Elberfeld Barmen, in which he took a lively part. In a letter to Marx he reports that 3 communist meetings had been held with 40 people at the first, 130 at the second and 200 at the third. The thing is a great attraction. People are talking of nothing but communism, and we are winning new supporters every day. Communism is a verite in the Wuppertal, indeed, it is a power already. This power afterwards capitulated before a simple police order, and the situation was peculiar enough in all conscience. Engels himself reports that only the proletariat remained aloof from this communist movement, whilst the stupidest, laziest and most Philistine people, who normally interested themselves in nothing but their own private affairs, were beginning to become almost enthusiastic about it. All this fitted in badly with what Engels wrote at the same time about the prospects of the English proletariat, but that was typical of the man. A splendid fellow from head to heels, always on the alert, fresh and keen-eyed, tireless, and yet not without a touch of that amiable folly which suits enthusiastic and courageous youth so well.